Good morning and hello everyone. So this is a recorded talk for my presentation at GRUYTER 20 in June 2022. In this talk, I will present a subset of an ongoing project on the conceptualizations of anger across languages where I focus on anger in Indonesians. And in this talk, I will only discuss the conceptual metonymy for anger in Indonesian. I will first introduce the cognitive linguistic view on metonymy and provide view examples. This is followed by highlighting what has and has not been covered in previous studies on anger in Indonesian context, including reviewing the classic study of anger in American English. And such a discussion brings us to the aim of this paper and the methodological aspects. Then I present the results from combining two methods in the study of metonymy in cognitive linguistics, highlighting the salient and prominent conceptual metonymies for anger in Indonesian, before finally I summarize the main findings in the conclusion. So let's begin with the first point. From the cognitive linguistic perspective, metonymy is viewed as a conceptual projection or conceptual mapping, whereby one experiential domain, the so-called target domain, is partially understood in terms of another experiential domain, the so-called the source domain. And for metonymy, these two domains, as well as the mapping between them, need to be happening and also included within the same common experiential domain. So let me illustrate this idea with some linguistic examples and also the respective metonymic mappings that are evoked or that are revealed by these examples. So here are two examples. The first two examples, she's just a pretty face and there are a lot of good heads at the university. In example one, the body part noun face is metonymically used to refer to the whole broader domain matrix of people or person. And if we consider again the definition of metonymy on the left-hand side of the slide, the subdomain of face is included in the domain of people as a whole. In other words, in example one, the domain of face is metonymically mapped onto the whole matrix domain of people. And this is an example of part for whole metonymy, which is also called synecdoche in the traditional approach. In example two, this also illustrates successive metonymic mappings within one common superordinate domain. So here the body part noun heads, which is the part, is included under the broader domain of person, the whole. And the head domain also includes as its part the intellectual attributes that are connected with it. Okay, so the mapping from head to person could be viewed as another example of part for whole metonymy. Meanwhile, the mapping from head to refer to the part of it, namely intellectual attribute, could be viewed as an example of whole four-part metonymy, because the head is not only including the intellectual attributes, but also other concepts and other parts and domains such as face, nose, mouth, and so on. Right, here are two other examples from emotion domain, namely sadness. In these examples, expressions such as drooping shoulders in example 3 and long face in example 4, they represent the effect, the presumed effect of sadness. And in turn, these physiological and behavioral effects, which are the parts, are mapped to refer to the whole superordinate domain of sadness. Okay, and we can visualize the metonymic mappings within the common domain for sadness from previous examples as we see in this slide. So the behavioral and bodily effects such as drooping shoulders and drooping facial muscles are mapped onto the whole domain of sadness. And it is because part of our experience with an emotion may include the effects of that emotion on our body and or behavior. And we can use those effects to indirectly denote the emotion itself. Okay, so that's a very brief tour of cognitive linguistic view of metonymy. Now moving on to the second part of the talk. Previous works on the conceptualizations of anger in Indonesian context mainly focus on the conceptual metaphors, and they address three central issues, namely the universality and variation of anger metaphors, the metaphors that are strongly attracted in statistical terms to anger compared to the other basic level emotions such as sadness, fear, love, and happiness. And lastly, the distinctive metaphors between anger near synonyms. These studies apply corpus linguistics approach that can be either corpus illustrated without statistical analysis and the quantitative corpus linguistic approaches that include statistical analysis. However, the missing part of this work is the treatment or analysis of metonymy of anger, which will be covered in the project that I'm working on. So now let us review the conceptual metonymies that have been proposed in classic account of anger in American English by George Lakoff and also Zoltan Kövecses. Lakoff and Kövecses chapter is one of the pioneering studies that sparked wave of research on metaphors and metonymies of emotion across languages. What we see in this slide is the system of conceptual metonymies for anger based on American English data. And the metonymies, as we have seen in the previous example, they represent the folk or common people understanding of the physiological effects of anger. And they are, in this slide, manifested in linguistic expressions that can denote increased body heat, such as don't get hot under the collar. Also expressions that indicate increased internal pressure, bodily agitation, as well as interference with accurate visual perception. Moreover, according to Lakoff and Kövecses, the increased body heat and internal pressure may lead to the redness and flushing in the facial and neck area, as shown by the expressions such as he was flushed with anger. Then, according to Lakoff and Kövecses 1987, the heat and pressure related metonymies such as body heat, internal pressure, redness in the face area, they become the bodily basis, metonymic basis for the central metaphor, anger is heat in American English. And this central metaphor has also been attested in several other languages that are not related genetically. And anger is heat itself can be elaborated into anger is fire and anger is the heat of a fluid in a container. So the point of this slide here is that it is important to study the metonymy for emotion in general because, well, as what we do in this collaborative project, the metonymy could provide the basis for the conceptual metaphor of emotion. Okay. So the aim of this paper is to analyze linguistic expressions that reveal conceptual metonymies for anger in Indonesians by combining two methods currently available for the study of emotion metaphors and metonymy, namely the classical type-based approach and the more recent corpus linguistic token-based approach. I'll briefly discuss how this works in a moment. And lastly, this paper also fills the gap from previous works that have not analyzed anger metonymy. That is part of the project that I'm working on, and the link to this project is included in the description of this video. So the lexical approach relies on gathering lexical items data that are related to the concept, either emotion or any other concept that is investigated. In this case, of course, the concept is anger, and this anger concept can be, lexicalized by such lexeme as marah, kemarahan, amarah, kegeraman, murka, and so on. And then the lexical items that we mean here is that they can be of various sorts, such as the synonyms of anger in this case, the antonyms, related words, and then idioms, phrases, collocation, and of course, most importantly, the definition of the lexeme for the concept in question. These lexical items are typically gathered from various sources, most likely the dictionaries, okay, thesauri, idiom, phrases, or collocation dictionaries, and any other collection of words and phrases that are related to the concept in question, such as those provided in the Wordnet database. Then the most important thing is that we need to check and determine which of these lexical items show metaphoric or metonymic conceptualizations, and then we group them thematically under their coherent source domain. Of course, this grouping and source domain analysis involve qualitative, interpretation as well as qualitative analysis. So here are the data sources for the lexical approach that I use in this project. There are PDF sources for the dictionary and 2 other online sources, namely the Thesauri and also Indonesian Wordnet. We can talk more in the discussion session if you wonder why I did not include the online Kamus Besar Bahasa Indonesia as the source. And then for the corpus-based data, I use the open source corpus of the Indonesian Leipzig corpora collections, over 200 million word tokens. And these texts predominantly come from randomly chosen website and online news, and also from small other sources, including Wikipedia dumps. So for the corpus-based approach, I follow Anatol Stefanovic's metaphorical pattern analysis and retrieve 1,000 random occurrences for each of the Indonesian anger words that I analyzed, namely marah, amarah, and kemarahan. In the full paper, I show that these 3 words are statistically more predominant compared to their synonyms such as murka, gram, and so on. So that's the reason why I choose these 3 words. So the corpus-based data will be in the form of classic concordance or keyword in context display that you can get from standard corpus linguistic software. And then the 3 anger words here are also used as the search terms to retrieve data from the sources for the lexical approach that we have seen before, especially to search through the Indonesian sources. For the Indonesian English bilingual dictionary, we search the PDF version and search through the entries whose definition contains the English terms angry or anger. So this allows me to retrieve only anger-related entries more efficiently rather than reading through the dictionary manually. But of course, there is extensive manual aspects from these procedures where we need to determine on a case-by-case basis manually whether the expressions that we have gathered are metonymical or metaphorical. And also we determine the conceptual mappings that are evoked. I'm not going to talk about this in detail here, but feel free to ask that in the discussion session later on if needed. Right. So in brief, the metonymy is identified via linguistic expressions that refer to the physiological and behavioral responses for anger as proposed in the literature. And we see a few examples before in American English. And also I use the categories that have been proposed in the previous studies, as well as in the context of the current projects where we receive a sample chapter draft from one of the lead editors that work on the American English data. Now, to determine the salience or prominence of the conceptual metonymy, in the lexical approach, we quantify the number of types of metonymic expression for a given conceptual metonymy. In other words, we measure the type frequency of conceptual metonymy by counting the different types of metonymic linguistic expressions that evoke that conceptual metonymy. In the corpus-based approach, we can count not only the type frequency of the conceptual metonymy as in the lexical approach, but we also can count the token frequency of the metonymy, namely the total number of occurrences of the metonymic expression for a given conceptual metonymy. Okay, and then the conceptual metonymies are ranked order based on those measures. But in this talk, I will report only on the type frequency measures that is represented as percentage of types for a given conceptual metonymy. Let's see the results. So here are 2 bar charts showing the results from lexical approach on the left-hand side, the blue bar charts, and the corpus approach on the right-hand side, the dark purple bar charts. So in the horizontal x-axis down below, you will see the percentage of the number of types for a given conceptual metonymy, which is the conceptual metonymy which are shown in the vertical y-axis. So among the 2 approaches, the most predominant metonymy is related to or has to do with strong aggressive verbal behavior. So this means that verbal behavior is prominent source domains that can be used to indicate or denote anger in Indonesians. We will see a few examples in a moment. So overall, from the two approaches, I find convergence in 72% of the metonymies that are shared between the two approaches. Some of these shared metonymies have also been proposed and identified for anger in American English by Lykov and Kövecses 1987, such as redness in the facial area, body heat, internal pressure, visual interference, and violent, frustrated behavior. So these findings point to or suggest to near universality in the metonymic conceptualization of anger, at least between Indonesian and the American English data that we have so far. Moreover, the two approaches can complement one another because few other metonymies are only attested in either approach. So that means if we choose just one approach, we may miss certain types of metonymy. All right, so now let's see a few linguistic examples for some of these metonymies. The first one are related to the strong aggressive verbal behavior that can be used to stand for anger. So these metonymic expressions have to do with harsh communication or speech verbs or speech nouns, such as mendamprat, latah mulut, teriakan marah, and somebody menaikkan suara. The experience of anger raises his or her voice. Okay, then the next example is aggressive visual behavior for anger. This conceptual metonymy is evoked by expressions that denote aggressive facial expressions by the experiencer of anger, such as menyeringai, twist into grin, muka sengit, sharp face, and mata menyorot marah, eyes glance angrily. Then this metonymy could be seen related to the previous one in that the focus is on the physiological effects in the facial area, but here the focus is on the flushing or redness that is happening in the facial area when being angry, such as merah telinga, red ears, darah menyembur ke muka, blood gushes to the face, and wajah menjadi kemerah-merahan karena nyala api marah. Face become reddish because of the flame of anger. The redness in the facial area could also be triggered or concur with increased body heat, as shown by the expressions such as pemanas hati, heater of the liver, meradang to become inflamed, feverish, and by extension becoming angry, panas kuping, hot ears, or to be angry. Internal pressures could trigger also redness in the facial area. Such increase is reflected in the facial expressions, of course, to hold such intense internal pressure. So the linguistic expressions include darah tinggi, high blood pressure, cepat darah, quick blood, and rahang mengeras karena desakan marah. Jaw hardens because of the push or pressure of anger. Okay, so those are a few examples for the salient conceptual metonymy for anger in Indonesians, and feel free to ask more examples in the discussion later on. As a conclusion, most of the results from the two methods, lexical as well as the corpus-based approach, converge in revealing the salient conceptual metonymies for anger in Indonesian. And some of these metonymies are similar to those identified in American English, and then such similarities suggest near universality of the common understanding, common people, folk understanding for the metonymic conceptualizations of anger across Indonesian and American English data, of course, spending more data from different languages that the other chapter contributors are working on. Finally, the conceptual metonymies that we identify can be classified into two broad types, namely the social communicative behavior, such as violent visual behavior, as well as aggressive verbal behavior, and another type, namely physiological based metonymy, such as body heat and increased internal pressure. So I think that's about it, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions in the discussion session later on. Thank you and bye-bye. See you soon.